Good afternoon, everyone. This is Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is our post-2020 election legislative update, reporting not from Washington, D.C. today, but from Virginia, in the home office of Virginia. And we have quite a bit of things to talk about, so we shall get right into it. As always, if you have questions, things that I talk about that don't make sense, that you disagree with, or things that I don't talk about that you wish we would talk about, put it into the chat box on your screen and we'll rotate back to it at the end of the discussion. Okay, start with the presidential update. This is more or less the current state of the presidential election. Some of the states that are gray have been called by some folks. Some of them have not. Rather than getting into kind of the details of each one of these states, right now, Senator Biden is in the lead. By how much depends on what you're going to count and what you're not going to count. President Trump is losing. And there's a saying in politics that being up 1% in the polls a week before the election or whatever is meaningless, but that it's much better to be up one than down one. And there are still ways that President Trump could pull this out. I think he needs help from the courts, but that's not unreasonable, although it is unlikely. But, you know, at this point in the election count, being down is not good. And so of the states remaining, Alaska's definitely going to go for Donald Trump. It just it takes a long time to get the votes in Alaska. It looks like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada will go for Donald Trump, will go for Senator Biden, although there's lawsuits in several of them. Arizona looked like it had gone fairly decisively for Joe Biden, but the later returns are kind of squishy, and so that might change. My understanding is that Pennsylvania has been called by some folks for Senator Biden, but it's a little early for me to make that kind of determination. I like these things to sit for a couple days and see what happens. North Carolina looks like it'll go for Donald Trump, and Georgia is kind of a mystery at this point. The numbers have been moving rather dramatically away from Donald Trump in the last couple of days. So this is where we stand on the presidential level. I am going to assume for the rest of this presentation that Senator Biden ends up becoming president. That is the more likely outcome at this point, but we'll see more as the courts start to weigh in on things. We do have some other results which are quite interesting. In the Senate, it looks like the Democrats will gain between 1 and 3 Senate seats, which is short of a majority. So the Democrats are almost certainly not going to take control of the Senate. Now, this result will hinge on 2 special elections coming out of Georgia. Georgia has an unusual system of running primaries in that they don't. It's actually the same system Louisiana uses. What happens is everybody that wants to run for an office runs on election day. So in this case, November 3rd. Then in order to win in that kind of open election format, you have to get 50% of the vote. No candidate did that on November 3rd for the 2 Senate seats. When that happens, the top 2 vote getters face a runoff in January. And so in both Senate seats, Johnny Isakson, former senator from Georgia, left office early, which is why there's a special election as well as a regular election in Georgia. So both of those seats look likely. One of them Senator Perdue might pull it out and get 50% and hold on to his seat. But at this point, he's at like 49.6% of the vote. So he's just shy of 50%. Now, having said all that, if you look at the vote totals that all the Republican candidates and all the Democratic candidates got on election night, the Republicans won both seats. But in one case, there were actually 16 candidates running, so the vote was spread out. Moreover, in a special election, unexpected special election, shortly after Christmas in January, when no one is expecting there to be an election, the general rule of thumb is that Republicans vote more regularly than Democrats do. So you would expect the Republicans to have less difficulty getting their voters to turn out than the Democrats will. Moreover, if Senator Biden goes on to win the presidential election, Republicans will be disappointed and angry, whereas Democrats will be happy. It's easier to motivate angry people to act than happy people. So I think the Republicans will have an advantage in both Senate races in Georgia. They only need to to win one to hold on to a majority, assuming they hold on to the Senate seat in North Carolina, which looks likely. So Democrats will gain between 1 and 3 seats in the Senate, but they will not probably take control of the legislature. Republicans are set to gain between 8 and 12 House seats, which is a bit unexpected. Most folks, including myself, thought there was a decent chance that they would lose a couple seats, although I thought there was a better chance they'd pick up a couple, but not a dozen. But the Republicans aren't going to gain control of the House either. Now, there is a theoretical way, like there's a theoretical way the Democrats could take the Senate. There is a theoretical way Republicans could take the House, but it's kind of unlikely. And so we'll end up with a Republican Senate and a Democratic House with the majorities in both being smaller than they were, this year in October. Republicans gained 1 governor's seat. That was Montana. And at the moment, 1 state legislative chamber has switched parties. The Republicans took control of the Senate in New Hampshire. There is an outside chance that the Democrats could take control of the House in Arizona, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen. There's a number of other legislatures that are kind of still a mess, and so we don't really know yet. But the likely outcome in the state legislature races is that there will be 1 chamber that switches parties. Add all this together, and you end up with very, very little. And I think that's the big story from election night, which is not a lot changed. Yes, the Democrats are likely to take the presidency, which is, of course, a very big deal. But they did it by the barest of majorities, just like Donald Trump won by the tiniest of margins in the popular votes in a number of states. Joe Biden won probably just slightly more than the minimum number of states he needed to win the presidency. In the Congress, there was very little shift. I mean, there were some seats here and there, but it was very small. By historic standards, these are very small shifts. 1 governor's race, 1 state legislature. This is the fewest number of state houses that have changed parties since 1994. And it's possible it's the fewest number of state legislative seats that have changed parties since about then as well. And given how tumultuous this year has been, given how much noise there was in the political system, the lack of change is pretty darn remarkable. So what do we have in Washington next year? We will likely have a Biden presidency, split government in Congress, and narrow majorities in both, which means we have split government again. It's worth noting that this is the most common result in American history. It is actually unusual for one party to control the presidency and both chambers of Congress. The American public seem to like to have a split government, which, by the way, also helps the Republicans in those Senate seats in January. Let's look a little deeper at what actually happened. Now, based on the exit polls that we have already, it appears that Donald Trump made gains, although not dramatic gains, in every demographic group that they look at in the exit polls, except oddly white men, where he did notably worse. So the decline in his vote percentage among white men offset his increased percentage among African Americans, women, pretty much all the other subsets there as well, which is a bit of a surprise. Joe Biden, for his part, did worse than expected in urban areas because he did worse among African Americans than expected, but he made it up in the suburbs. Now, 2 things to note about this. First of all, this is all based on exit polls, and exit polls are notoriously bad. Nobody knows how to do good exit polls, at least with the budgets they have to spend on it. And so these exit poll numbers tend to move over the next couple months and years as people really dig into what happened. But the conclusions that we're reaching at the moment may prove to be wrong. The other thing we note is that the demographic shifts between the various subsets of the population were relatively tiny. A couple percentages here, 4 or 5 percentages there, which again is kind of remarkable given how unusual the 2016 election was, how unusual the Trump administration has been, and the anger, the noise, the pandemic, all the other stuff going on in society, that not a lot of people change their minds. And I'm not sure what that means, but I think it's interesting. The one possible exception to this is Hispanics. There is some decent evidence already that Hispanics moved rather decisively towards the Republican Party in this election. Doesn't mean they're going to stay there, but it does mean they did for this election. For example, Republicans picked up House seats in South Florida, Miami, which used to be a solid Democratic district. Now, that's not that surprising because the Hispanics in Miami tend to be Puerto Rican and most especially Cuban. And Cuban Americans tend to be Republicans, whereas most other Hispanics tend to be Democrats. Thing of it is, though, the Republicans also held on to a seat in South South Texas, a seat that was drawn to elect an Hispanic Democrat, has now elected a Republican, in this case, a Hispanic Republican, instead. Republicans also picked up a House seat in South New Mexico, which is a heavily Hispanic district. And those two districts are not Cuban. They're Central American and Mexican Americans. And you can see in Nevada, for example, where Donald Trump was more competitive than we thought, in Arizona, where he may end up winning, Donald Trump made up the difference. He lost votes among a lot of college-educated white voters, but he picked up a lot of that in Hispanic voters. Donald Trump's problem is that there aren't very many Hispanic voters in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so he wasn't able, apparently, to make up the losses among white voters by wooing Hispanic voters. And again, whether this lasts, we'll have to see, but I think that's really the only big demographic shift that we can identify at the moment in the electorate. Overall, this has kind of been an ongoing thing over the last 5 or 6 years. There seems to be a realignment of the electorate. Democrats have been gaining slowly but steadily strength among college-educated and upper middle-class Americans. Upper middle-class Americans used to be a fairly solid Republican voting bloc, and that is no longer the case. Republicans continue to gain strength among blue-collar Americans and maybe minority Americans. African Americans, Donald Trump did better than any Republican presidential candidate among African Americans since 1960. And like I mentioned a minute ago, Hispanic Americans. Now, that shift is newer, and so it's not clear that that will survive Donald Trump. I mean, that may have been a vote for Trump as opposed to a vote for the Republicans. But Republicans did do well down ticket, and so it suggests it was a movement towards the party, not the person. Bottom line here is that not a lot changed since 2016. Yes, we'll have a different president, but that we have a different president by a tiny little shift in tens of thousands of votes, as opposed to shifts of millions. And that is peculiar in American history. We usually see greater shifts than this. Talked about this in our last update. Before the election, this is the process that we will go through if there is a disputed result in the election. I don't think that's going to happen anymore. I think that by Thanksgiving, we will have a definitive winner. But just to remind you, states set their own rules for picking electors. So the Trump administration, Donald Trump's campaign rather, can't challenge a state's rules saying that they're unfair, that they violate federal law, unless, other than discrimination and a few other grounds for those sorts of things. What the Trump campaign is going to have to argue is that the states violated their own rules. Probably. I mean, there's some gray area in there. But that's a very hard standard to meet, which is why these kind of lawsuits generally don't succeed. Doesn't mean they won't in this case, just means it's less likely. So right now we're still in step number 1. There will be a lot of yelling and screaming and lawsuiting and lawyers running around screaming for the next probably week before this starts to get settled. But by December 8th, we will probably be done. And these lawsuits will probably have gone away or will go away on that day, and we will have a definitive winner. So we don't get to see what happens if the vote goes to the House and the Senate. It's also worth noting that if there are disputed slates of electors on January 6th, when both chambers of Congress will meet to hear the certificates of ascertainment and the formal casting of electoral votes, if there is a dispute, the Democrats will still control the House and the Republicans will still control the Senate. And what that means is it's unlikely either party is going to be able to launch an actual, they're actually be able to challenge the certificates of ascertainment. If the 2 Georgia seats have not been seated, it's possible that on January 6th, there will in fact be more Democrats than Republicans in the Senate pending those two elections, which of course will make it even more difficult for Republicans to challenge the results. And bottom line is, we're going to get a president on January 20th, despite all the noise and the chaos. Now, a quick word about the noise and the chaos. As I mentioned a couple times on these updates, I worked as the chairman of the electoral board for my local jurisdiction. I have run elections. I have dealt with candidates that wanted to get results right this very moment as soon as the polls closed. What I always told them was, it is not actually needed or necessary that America knows who our president is the day after election. That's nice, but it's not required either by the law or, more importantly, by the proper functioning of a healthy democracy. There is absolutely no problem with us having to wait a couple weeks to find out who the winner is. What is important is that we get an accurate winner, that the winner that becomes president accurately reflects what happened on election day, not that we know who that will be immediately. So all this noise and chaos that we're seeing in the country right now is actually not that big a deal in the overall scheme of things for the country. Democracies can tolerate a great deal of screaming and yelling without any sort of damage. And the screaming and yelling that's going on now is unlikely to produce any long-term problem. So for those of you who don't enjoy the yelling and screaming, just tolerate it or tune it out. It will go away. And then on January 20th, we will have a new president. We do have some interesting additions to Congress. There will be a lot more people in our next update as I go through all the winners, and a lot of the close House seats haven't been called yet. But Senator Mark Kelly, who the senator-elect, will likely win the Arizona Senate race. He is an aeronautical engineer and former astronaut, so he is one of our guys. Similarly, Anthony Gonzalez, who won that Hispanic seat in South Texas, is a DoD cryptologist, and that is likely to be useful when we go up to Congress to talk about quantum computing, AI, and a few other things. There are a couple other legislators who may end up winning, or a couple of candidates who may end up winning with backgrounds in engineering or science that I'll mention as soon as they've been declared. But at the very least, it looks like we'll have two new partners. A number of our long-term allies, Senator Peters in Michigan, for example, barely won, but did in fact win, we think, his Senate race. And so some of our top allies will be returning as well, which puts us in good shape for next year to move some of our legislative agenda. Let's talk about that. Actually, first, let's talk about the rest of 2020. The 116th Congress isn't over. It will end technically on January 3rd when the new Congress is sworn in. And they have a couple things they have to get done before then. More accurately, a couple things they have to get done before they can go home for Christmas. But it's worth noting that because neither chamber changed parties, the objective of both parties at this point in Congress is to just go home. And so there's unlikely to be a lot of patience for any sort of real battles at this point. The NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, will get passed probably in early December. It will, as far as we know, contain our AI language, the language we support on quantum computing and on 5G deployment. It will probably not, although this is less certain at this point, include significant new funds for research of any kind, the Endless Frontiers Act, or the CHIPS Act. Because those are all spending measures, they will likely be stripped from the final version of the bill. But we're set up nicely to move them next year. More on that in a minute. We're expecting the FY21 budget to be finished in early December. It's not likely to deviate all that much from the 2020 budget. A little bit here, a little bit there, but it'll basically be an omnibus bill that'll just continue spending into next year, and they'll figure they'll fight it out next time. There is some hope of a COVID relief bill this year. Not a tremendous amount, because the two parties are still very far apart on kind of the heart of the bill. But maybe the election gives people room to make some concessions to the other side. Maybe the Trump administration decides if in fact they do end up losing the presidential race, which again is likely, maybe they simply decide not to fight anymore and just agree to whatever. I think that's unlikely because the differences between the two parties are fairly stark, but there's still hope. And Senator McConnell, who will return as Senate Majority Leader, probably, has said he would like a COVID relief bill. But I think, again, that was more public posturing than actually a statement that he was willing to start making concessions. But we'll see. We'll know more about this next week. All right, let's look to 2021. Some of our policy priorities next year are actually in pretty good shape to make some real progress. I've mentioned this before on research policy. Both parties have high-profile plans that involve significantly increasing spending on specifically research, technology research, also health research, but from our perspective, technology research. The Endless Frontier Act is part of that. That will be a priority bill next year, and we will fight for it and see if we can get it passed. Then we have the Foundries Act and the CHIPS Act, which are very, very similar. Either one or both of them, or a bill that combine the two of them, will also be a priority next year that we will support. There will also be a big push for increased funding for university research. This is part of the COVID relief bill. We'll have to see what happens with COVID to know if there's going to be another COVID relief bill next year. But the universities are going to push for aid from the federal government because they're getting stretched in a lot of ways. Next year. That's less likely to happen than the tech research bills, but of course the tech research bills will help the universities, so they're connected there. Immigration policy is going to be a little bit problematic, I suspect, next year, and also very promising, depending on what part of it we look at. As we've talked about on these updates before, the Trump administration has been very, very good in our perspective on H-1Bs and other temporary visas, and they've been very bad on green cards and student visas. What we're hearing out of the Biden camp is that they intend to be very good on student visas and green cards and very bad on H-1Bs. So we'll win half of them either way. I expect the Biden administration to move fairly quickly to roll back most of the Trump administration's immigration policies. We are hearing that will include the H-1B reforms, although we are going to push the Biden administration to keep at least some of them, particularly the most recent change, which is the new rules on allocating H-1B visas based on pay instead of just allocating them randomly. We, of course, will support the Biden administration as they do what they can to make it easier for skilled immigrants to get green cards and easier for international students to get visas. If we're looking at bigger reform to actually fix the problem, because of course the president can't really fix the problem here because they can only, the law is the law. The problem is we still will likely have a deadlock in Congress. It's difficult to see how a major immigration bill is going to navigate either, the House or Senate. We could get a bill passed in either one of them, but anything we can get passed in the House is unlikely to be taken up at the Senate, and anything we can get through the Senate is unlikely to be taken up in the House. How we break that logjam, I'm not sure, because we've been trying to break it since about 1995, and we haven't made too much progress. But we'll keep working at it. We'll keep talking to legislators and making sure they understand the importance of high-skill immigration and the damage done by a poorly structured H-1B visa program. Contracting rules we talked about in detail last time. Because the Republicans are controlling the Senate, there's no clear path forward for either a national AB5 bill or the PRO Act. It's also worth noting that California passed Proposition 22, which made AB5 not apply to gig economy workers, Uber, Lyft, Grubhub, things like that. The referendum doesn't really affect technology engineers, unfortunately, but it does send a fairly clear signal to Democrats, particularly in California, that their public is not terribly thrilled with what they're doing on this, which I suspect will cause them to think twice about trying to take this national. Even if they do, it's unlikely to get a particularly good hearing in the Senate. This gives us time to educate legislators on the issue. This is a real problem. The definition used to determine if someone is an independent contractor or an employee is a real problem, and it could use a real solution if we could get one. We just have to help legislators, lawmakers understand the unique business models used by technology consultants so that we are protected when the law is changed. And this will be a priority for IEEE-USA next year in Congress and in the states. Now, Want to kind of wrap up on a positive note. Space policy. There's been some really good stuff happening with space policy during the Trump administration, including the Space Force, creating Space Force and a new branch of the military just to focus on outer space. And that's likely to go away. The policy is too closely tied to Donald Trump for it to survive a Biden presidency. This is common of all presidents. When you come in, the first thing you do is you try to get rid of everything associated with the guy you replaced. That is especially true when you just defeated the previous president in an election, and you're from different parties, obviously. So I fully expect Space Force to be moved back under the Air Force. But the basic structure, the basic leadership that has already been put in place to really focus some attention on outer space in the Defense Department will probably still be maintained because we need it. And so even if Space Force itself doesn't survive, the fact that there was a Space Force should encourage the Defense Department and therefore the federal government to focus more on space than they were previously. Artemis, which is the president's proposal for putting a woman and a man on the moon by 2024, is likely to go away as well. Again, Artemis is too high profile a name. It's a good name, frankly. And the program is too high profile and too closely associated with President Trump for President Biden to allow it to continue, which of course doesn't mean they're not going to do what Artemis said they were going to do. It just means they're going to come up with a new name. The plan for Artemis is to put a woman on the moon by the end of 2024, and that would be the end of Joe Biden's first term if it were to happen. And of course, even though it was Donald Trump's idea, Joe Biden's president, he gets credit for it. And so I seriously doubt he's going to tell them not to do it because, you know, who doesn't want to be the president when the first woman steps on the moon? And so they're going to change the name. They're going to make it look different. They're going to say to everybody that listen that it's a different program, but it'll end up in the same place, which is Americans on the moon, probably, which is kind of cool and exciting. So neither of these two changes, getting rid of space or moving Space Force back into the Air Force and getting rid of Artemis, is likely to actually change policy all that much, which is good because we kind of like the policy. And it's also note that there has been bipartisan consensus on both the importance of space exploration and the general direction of space exploration going back two administrations. And so this is not new, and in particular, commercial space policy. I think the reason the American space enterprise is doing so well relative to other countries is because we're finding a way to get private sector businesses involved in a major way. And nobody else can do that. Plus, if we can do that, if we can make it profitable to go into outer space, the whole calculation for space changes in very positive ways. And it looks like we've done that. Commercial space, the idea of commercial space started in George Bush's administration, was picked up and improved upon, expanded upon by the Obama administration, and then picked up and expanded and improved upon by the Trump administration. But it's been all basically the same policy. And so I expect that a Biden presidency would continue the trend to make it easier for private companies to operate in space, to get the licenses and all the things you need to operate at that sort of business, and to encourage the private sector to become a partner with NASA in doing American space exploration, which is very cool. And so despite all the animosity and all the yelling and all the anger in Washington between the two parties, space policy is not where that is. And we are encouraged that that will continue regardless of who becomes president on January 20th. IEEE-USA's priorities in 2021. I've already mentioned these. Focus on the technology investments. We have some opportunities to get some major bills passed that will have a profound impact on engineers, technology professionals in the United States for the next decade at least, possibly much longer than that. So that is quite exciting. We're going to fight for green card reform and H-1B reform, but of course the priority is always on the green cards. we always do a tremendous amount of work on tech implementation and promotion. And what I mean by that is just simply helping government and helping policymakers understand technology, understand how it can be used, and understand how regulatory rules can affect what technology can and can't do in good ways and bad ways. And so simply helping legislators, rulemakers, policymakers understand how technology fits into society is a big part of what we do, and we'll do that regardless of who controls Congress and the presidency. And we're going to be focusing on the small business consultant issue as well, getting ahead of the PRO Act and making sure that when the two parties settle on a compromise, which theoretically they will do someday, looking at the independent contractor rules, that IEEE's consultant members are protected. You, of course, have a role in all of this. Many of you will have new legislators. Somebody needs to go talk to them and tell them who IEEE is, what technology engineers do, and what we care about. Because of COVID, and these restrictions are continuing, DC insiders are not as useful or as powerful as they used to be, but regular people are. And there's nothing better than a close election to remind politicians why they have to pay attention to their voters. For those of you who are interested in getting involved, now is the perfect time to do it. We are always looking for volunteers to serve on our policy committees, to help craft the formal statements that state what it is that IEEE-USA represents and believes in. And I will announce for the first time here that we are planning on doing a Congressional Visits Day next year, but that it will probably be local. That is, we're not going to try to bring people into Washington to meet with legislators. We're going to try to get you to meet with legislators in your home district, which is both easier and, frankly, in these days, I think it's actually more powerful. Because events will be done locally, there's not going to be a day. I mean, we're going to target a day at the end of March, but some of these meetings could happen a week or even a month or two later, which is still fine. Keep your eye out for the registration page to go up on the IEEE-USA website sometime in the next couple weeks. And I hope all of you will sign up to join us virtually here in Washington, and then to take advantage of this perfect opportunity to introduce yourself to your new legislators or to reintroduce yourself to your old legislators. So pay attention. The updates for that will be out, like I said, in about a month. Last note. Our next update will be December 4th. Now, that is not in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now is the IEEE-USA board meeting, and so I'm unable to give an update on that day. So instead, we'll have an update and I don't want to give an update the day after Thanksgiving because you and I do not want to talk about politics on the day after Thanksgiving. So instead, our next update will be December 4th. By then, we'll have a very good idea of what the end of the 2016 Congress will bring, what the final decisions on the budget and NDAA and everything else will be. We'll also know who the president is, and we should have a very good understanding of what the partisan breakdown of the two chambers of Congress are, other than the two Georgia seats. So hope you join us on the 4th, 1 o'clock Eastern. I'm Russ Harrison. If you have any questions, please get them in the chat box now. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA. My direct phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll go see if we have any questions. Oh, quite a bit. Yes, Brendan, a couple people have mentioned we can call it Diana, which apparently, and one of them is the Greek name and one of them is the Roman name, and I always get them confused. Yep, Mark, your point about Hispanic backgrounds, or not all Hispanics, is actually true. The concept of Hispanic is actually much more complicated than it sounds. There's not actually a lot of cultural overlap between, say, Cubans and Argentinians. The two countries have dramatically different histories, some similarities, of course, but they're dramatically different. And their cultural attitudes and political attitudes are very different. Moreover, one of the trends we're seeing in the demographics of the United States is that the longer people from Latin American countries are in the United States, the more likely they are to consider themselves to be white. And this actually is a trend in the United States. To a European, it is absolutely preposterous that a Swede and a Greek person are considered the same race. But in this case, in our country, they're both considered white. That tends to happen in this country. The ethnicities get all jumbled up and just become Americans over time, and that seems to be happening fairly quickly with Hispanics. So yes, I did overly simplify the terms for the purpose of this conversation, but your point is well taken. What do I think of Ro Khanna's recent proposal for spreading tech workers more broadly across the country? Yes, thank you, Brendan, for reminding me to bring this up. This is quite interesting. Ro Khanna is a congressman that represents part of Silicon Valley. And when he was running for office and when he first got into office, he talked a lot about bringing Silicon Valley to the rest of the country. And what he meant by that was bringing the innovation and the entrepreneurialism that is so dramatic in Silicon Valley and pulling that into the rest of the country. So you have little Silicon Valleys popping up all over the place. And to be entirely honest with you, I didn't think he meant it. Or more accurately, I thought he'd give it up once he got into Congress, because after all, he represents Silicon Valley. Why would he want those businesses going someplace else? Much to my surprise, Ro Khanna has actually introduced legislation that will do precisely what he said he would do. And I give him tremendous credit for that he is actually thinking about innovation in a national context and using his seat in Congress to try to bring or to encourage entrepreneurialism, particularly tech entrepreneurs, in other parts of the country. He introduced the bill a little bit too late to do much of it with this Congress, but I am very excited about working with him on this next year. I think his idea is something the country really needs, and I give him tremendous amount of credit for doing something that's good for people that don't vote for him, which a lot of legislators won't do, but Ro Khanna will. I'm pleased to say he's been a friend of ours since he got into Congress, and we're looking forward to working with him on this as well. Assuming, so this is my boss, Steve Welby, assuming that President Trump leaves office in January, who will drive the Republican agenda, particularly in the Senate? Biden will probably drive the agenda in the Senate. First of all, I think there's actually very, very little chance that if by January, by January 6th, when they do the formal electing, if Donald Trump doesn't have 270 electoral votes, I see there's very little chance that there will be any more. I mean, he'll say some stuff and he'll tweet some things, but if he loses, he's going to lose. The thing is, though, that will leave the Republicans in the minority in Washington, D.C. The Democrats will control the presidency and the House. The Republicans will have a very small majority in the Senate, which makes it very difficult to get things done. So I suspect mostly what the Republicans will do is respond to what the Democrats are doing. And they'll be, particularly because the Democrats in the House will only have a small majority, and the Republicans will be thinking, hey, if we play our cards right, we can take the House in 2022. They'll spend a lot of their time positioning themselves for the next election. It's one of the advantages of being the minority. You don't necessarily have to get anything done. Of course, a lot of what the Biden administration will do will require the Senate to approve it. You know, all the appointments, any judges that need to be appointed, all of that will have to go through the Senate, which will give Mitch McConnell a great deal of say. But I mean, the Republicans in the Senate will want to pass things, but they know they can't pass anything without working with the Democrats, which do, of course, give the Democrats kind of more than 50% of the say, which means they'll be doing anything that actually gets passed will be driven more from the Democrats than the Republicans. Biden's Build Back Better investment. Yeah, the issue of infrastructure improvements has been lurking in the background ever since Donald Trump was elected, and nothing ever came of it. I suspect, so there's two ways that an infrastructure bill could move. It can move as just a straight up infrastructure bill, which would include some things that we like broadband deployment and electrical grid improvements. But it could also be wrapped into a COVID relief bill. Infrastructure is actually a pretty good way to stimulate the economy, because it not only does it create jobs relatively quickly, but it also it spreads the jobs around the country, but also the benefits of that spending last for a long time. So if you're going to spend a lot of money to kind of revitalize the economy, infrastructure is a good place to look to do it. So I think there's a good chance that that will happen. Whether it'll be Biden administration's top priority or not, I'm not sure, but I would be surprised if they didn't at least try to start moving the ball on this by the summer of 2021. Prospects for rural broadband legislation are good. Once Congress, so the pandemic has clearly demonstrated to pretty much everybody that we need better internet service in this country, and that includes rural broadband. A lot of places, particularly when you get immediately off a college campus, many of which are in rural America, or immediately outside a national lab, most of which are in rural America, a lot of rural America does not have particularly good internet connection, and it's quite clear that that's a problem. So you have an interesting dynamic here where Democrats in general are supportive of investments in broadband and technology. They are particularly interested in improving broadband access in poorer parts of urban America, which need it. Republican areas of the country include rural America. They need broadband as well. So the two parties are oddly aligned on this particular one. And so I think there's actually a very, very good chance we'll get broadband expansion in the next Congress. Now, the question is whether it'll just be part of the regular business cycle, a budget cycle, which means we won't get it till December of 21, or it will be a standalone bill or wrapped into something like the Endless Frontier Act. There's lots of different ways you can do it. But I think that that's a fairly easy one in the next Congress. The only thing holding it back is Congress's ability to get its act together. But beyond that, I think we're actually in good shape. Historically, infrastructure spending get driven by catastrophic failures. It does, but we had a catastrophic failure, and that was COVID. The fact is that school systems around the country that tried to go virtual found out that they couldn't because lots of people didn't have adequate internet connection. That rural hospitals found that they couldn't do telemedicine nearly as well as they thought they could. And, lots of these little stories, and we've heard, and we've shared with legislators stories. The national labs thought they could send their researchers home and that they could continue working, just doing it remotely. But what they found out is as soon as you got off the campus of a national lab, and a national lab has state-of-the-art top line internet connectivity, but 10 miles away really doesn't. And so when a lot of these researchers went home, they found they couldn't do the work they thought they could do because they just didn't have access to decent internet. So, Don, in general, you're right. It takes something like a bridge collapse or something like that to get big infrastructure spending. But I think we just had one of those, not nearly as dramatic as a bridge collapse, fortunately. But it affected a lot more people than a bridge collapse. And by the way, bridges are still in rough shape, and so they're likely to get money too. And so I think we have a fairly good chance at getting an infrastructure bill next year because of COVID and because it's a good way to stimulate the economy if you do it right. All right, that's all the questions I see. Good conversation today. Again, my email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. My phone number is 202-530-8326. If you come up with any other questions later today, tomorrow, next week, whenever, feel free to reach out and ask, and I will answer them as best that I can. And until then, I want to thank you all for joining us. Hope you all survived the election season intact. Keep in mind that discord is a normal part of a democracy and that we have survived much, much worse than this. And on that, I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving, and I look forward to talking with you again on December 4th. Thank you.